Yeah, I'll leave the Google Doc as it is. It's editable by anybody, so it could get changed or it is something, but I won't do anything to it. So it should be there as long as nothing gets erased off of it or whatever. I think you can make a copy of it. You can save a copy of it as it is as well. So so several of the people I chatted with the question and answer sessions had gone through or are approaching or right there now what we call kensho or awakening, um, which really is the first big step or the first step on this path, um, this pathless path. It's defined or can be defined by uh, touching into something that is undeniable, beyond the usual ways we try to confirm what's real with thought. Um, it's just not subject to doubt at all, this truth. Um, and when we touch into that the first time, our identity, uh, in a big enough way at least, our identity, we could say, is altered, although properly what has happened is some false identity has fallen away. Some false identity has um, let go. And that never really, um, that insight never really goes away. Although at first it tends to be much more pronounced the first few weeks, few months, even a couple of years sometimes. And then there's the shadow work phase, usually some integration and emotion work needs to be done and so forth. But the the point I wanted to make, at least in the beginning of this talk, is that even once we've had that insight, um, or once we've had that insight, that shift, the remaining insights that I talk about or that we talk about, uh, insight into equanimity, insight into non-duality, and insight into the realization of no self, no separate self. Um, these are all approached through the lens of what is initially glimpsed. So, mechanistically, you could say that the first insight is an insight about mind, insight about thought, consciousness, and identity. And so, anytime beyond that initial awakening, anytime that is obscured or seems to be obscured, it's always valuable to return to that initial insight. And often we have the instinctual knowing of how to return to it, by just stopping making anything with the mind, stopping running away from anything, um, stopping grasping onto any cognitive form of identity, including a spiritual identity. And in that moment, um, we're returned to where we never left or never could leave. And that insight often is, or that ability, I guess, is clear and easy for many of us after the initial shift. For others, it can feel a little more fleeting, although we can return to it with some reminding, whether it's interacting with someone who can point to it, sitting, meditation, retreat settings, etc. But either way, it's important to know that that is the lens through which we're going to proceed to more subtle insights or deeper insights. Because if the mind isn't calm, if we don't know how to calm the mind, if we don't recognize the restlessness of thought, of seeking, of internal struggle, if we don't recognize that, then the further insights can be evasive. They will be evasive. So one takeaway of what I'm saying is that it's never wrong to just remain in the pure, boundless sense of consciousness. However you return to that, however that happens for you. Some people use a phrase or a technique or maybe even a mantra, something they've come up with to return themselves to that immediately. Other times it's just an instinctual knowing. But returning to that, sitting with that and in that is never wrong. It's never wrong practice. Through the lens of calm and undivided mind, then all other insights will come into alignment at some point. There are further contemplations. There are specific ways to investigate those, such as we did yesterday in the talk with the senses. So those types of approaches can be really helpful and valuable, and probably necessary for some people to investigate the nature of duality of form and so forth. But again, even then, it has to be balanced with some practice, some intention and time spent in this neutrality of consciousness. For some people, it feels like resting in the pure I am sense. Another way of saying this is that when the mind is calm, deeply calm, the body follows. Yet another way of saying it is when the mind is calm, and we're not struggling so much with mental identity, beliefs, and so forth that can be endlessly distracting. It's quite natural to start to investigate the deeper or more deeply rooted fixations that are associated with body sensations, or we could say emotion. So it's a natural progression from a calm mind to start to investigate what habitually stirs the pot deeper down in the body. So I guess the takeaway of what I'm saying here is that we we can overlook sometimes the simplicity and value of continuing to investigate directly, just um, through the power of our attention, the nature of thought and consciousness. Continuing to, as we discussed, I think in the first talk in this retreat, how to investigate a thought directly, the nature of one thought, the nature and substance of thought itself, to lead ourselves back to consciousness. Um, we can almost overlook that sometimes in pursuit of an insight like the experience of a non-dual taste that we've had, and trying to force that in a way, or push hard to clarify that insight into realization, but we're overlooking the fact that there's some polarity in the mind that we're not addressing. And often it's old pain, or an old fixation, or something in the emotion body that we just haven't addressed, or we just have overlooked a bunch of times. So starting with the correcting or adjusting the lens of consciousness, then usually the next lens is the lens of the deeper resistance patterns in reference to body sensations, the physicality of being alive. Uh, you could also say that the first aspect of identity to shift is the identity or identification with thought. And the second to shift is the identification with form or body. And they feel different experientially when they shift. The effects are somewhat different, um, but with a lot of overlapping aspects. The neutrality of the mind that I'm referring to um, can be approached many ways, of course, as we discuss frequently. But one suggestion, or one simple way of approaching it at any time, is to ask yourself, what is it right here that never grasps? Or what is it that's never grasping, never holding on right here? And finding that in your experience, however that it manifests, however that feels or appears. And also, when you have that sense, also, what is it here that never seeks? What is it here that's not looking for anything? And these essentially correspond to the illusion of past and the illusion of future, or the mental construct of the past and the mental construct of the future. We're grasping, not wanting to let go, or we're seeking, wanting to control our experience in the future. But both of those tendencies, both of those ways of interacting with thought, presuppose something that's not true. That is, that it's possible to grasp or possible to seek. Seeking and grasping really only exists when we've already accepted the context of the way thoughts see the world. If we don't go so far as to accept that context, that overlay of moving through time, of being an agent, if we don't accept that initially, or we don't buy in or presuppose that, then what is never holding on, what is never grasping, what is never seeking is simply just this, just the case. So that's why asking the thought, or I'm sorry, asking the question, formulating the question in that way, what is it that's here that never seeks? What is it that's here that never grasps? This can lead you back to this place of neutrality, simplicity. These are the kind of questions you can just try out with yourself at any time, and some may be valuable and others may not, or work. They may lead to a sort of cognitive space, or they may lead to clarity and presence. So it's just a matter of trying things sometimes. Another question you could ask would be, what is it to not have to manage anything? What is here that's never managing? What is it here that has no agenda? When you ask these questions, it may lead to something that feels instinctually true, real, alive, not bound by thought and concept. But that might be just part of your experience in the moment. And that's okay if it is. It also may be all of your experience in the moment. And of course, that's okay as well. But finding a way to lead yourself back to this neutrality of consciousness on a regular basis, I think is valuable if it's possible for you. Daily, a daily practice of meditation. And then from there, when we investigate, where is sound? We're investigating it. We're investigating that. We're asking that question from a place of conscious neutrality. Rather than a place of polarity. Because when we ask it from a place of polarity, we're trying to use it to make ourselves feel better. And we can overlook that for a long time, a surprising amount of time. That we're trying to use our investigations or our drive for insight. We're trying to use that to not feel something right now. and we don't see that happening. And that really can hold us up. When we see that, when we recognize, oh, okay, maybe I am trying to use whatever, something, a practice, a technique to make myself feel better rather than fully inhabiting this moment and just letting the truth come forward, then often we can just take a step back into this neutrality of consciousness for a while. And often by doing that, the polarities in the mind dissolve or soften at least. So it can take some time to realize the importance of this, I think, but over time it just becomes clearer that it is possible to inquire. It's certainly possible to inquire out of a natural curiosity, a natural enjoyment of the process itself, without trying to get some outcome. And the way to assure that is that we just go back to where the agendas stir, where they tend to hide, and that's up in the thoughts. So when we're working with any sort of inquiry, such as um, who hears the sound or what hears the sound, where does sound meet sensation, where does awareness meet the senses? We're working with any of that, and it feels like struggle, a lot of struggle, or it just feels frustrating, heavy. We're having trouble approaching it in a way that we just allow the experience to be what it is already, rather than we're trying to go to the experience or merge with something. We feel that, just it's helpful to learn to recognize that, and then do a round of meditation where you're just entering the neutrality, entering the contentlessness of consciousness and thought to the degree it's possible. Now, we can't always completely calm the mind, of course, and make there be no thoughts. That's not the point either. But we can knowingly reverse the polarity so we move toward instead of away from, toward any thought, any concept, any image that's stirring in the mind. So spending some time in that, again, often we return to a more specific and subtle contemplation about, say, the senses, and it'll feel different. It'll just feel more enjoyable, simpler. There'll be a natural curiosity rather than a desperation or a sense of wanting to control the experience itself. And the qualities um, the qualities that could be described about this neutrality of consciousness, but they don't have to be. And again, don't look for these necessarily, but you might feel in the qualities of this are also the qualities of non-dual experience, only in one way of speaking, I could just say that the non-dual experience or the non-dual realization is just completely all encompassing. It's like nothing is left out. A much clearer version of it, perhaps. But the qualities are the ones I mention frequently, that when we're oriented in consciousness toward any thought or any substance of consciousness or movement of consciousness, there's a natural curiosity, a natural interest in the experience itself. It's also experience close in the sense that the habituated tendency to make distance, to pull back from and observe, isn't there. It's quite the opposite. It's a tendency to move toward, to investigate directly, to close any gap, close any distance. That quality in consciousness feels a little bit more like an intention, more like a doing, like something you intentionally do or choose to do, which is fine. In non-dual realization, it's very obviously just built into reality. It's not, it feels completely not like something you're doing at all. The fascination, exuberance of just being alive, the depth of intimacy and contact is already there. It's just how it is. It's the only way things could be. The intimacy of color and form in regard to what we would call an object, usually anything, a face, a flower, a dog, a cat. The intimacy of the forms and colors that make that up is complete, in the sense that all other tendencies toward intimacy that we have in the mind in a seeking way are seen to be just shadows. This is the real thing. It's the real clarity, the real infinite contact. So it's built in to to reality itself. It is reality. So again, it's a clearer version of that, but the tendency to be oriented toward, to close all distance and gap, um, the knowing of the natural intimacy is all there. The feeling of love, which is not a personal feeling of love, and it's not a love of anything specific. It's not a conditional love, so it's not based on a certain condition, certain situation, person, um, sense, emotion. That starts to shine forth in consciousness when we have um, a neutral stance in consciousness. We start to experience contentlessness. There's a underlying warmth to it. Um, but it can feel a little maybe ill-descript, and it can almost feel like, um, it can feel a little more personal, maybe, like I'm the one experiencing that. Whereas with non-dual realization, the experience of love is, um, again, undeniable, and it's radiating from all appearances. It's intrinsic to appearance. It's intrinsic to experience. It's not separate. Love, experience, love are like the same thing. Um, and that's very clear. There's also, a certain equanimity with the neutrality of consciousness. We feel okay in a way that we maybe didn't before we were able to just let that consciousness be what it is, the ocean of consciousness. When we thought we were wave after wave trying to struggle to survive and hold our identity together or defend our identity, and then it shifted into the knowing of self as ocean, big S, self, or big M, mind as ocean. When that shift occurred, it became obvious, um, that there's a sort of okayness that seemed to really be missing before that awakening. Um, it was a conditional okayness before, perhaps contingent, one you had to earn. This is, unearned grace. We start to really know that, and when we have a significant or dramatic shift, a kensho experience, say, that's probably the most prominent aspect of it, is a deep okayness and peace that is all pervasive. Um, and we don't always notice it right away, but it's somewhat contingent upon the neutrality of consciousness, because then the consciousness at some point will get, some turmoil will occur again, some emotion will come to the surface when we start working through shadow, and it might feel like it's gone away for a short time, not really, but not as clear for sure. um, so you could say that there's an equanimity, but it's a bit conditional upon the calmness of the mind and spirit. um, with non-dual realization, the equanimity is essential to everything. It's, um, in one sense, if you could say, if everything is moving the same speed, then nothing is moving. It has that feel to it. Nothing could, rub up against anything and cause friction, because it's all one thing, really. But it's not a thing, and it's not, and even to say one, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Um, the vibrancy of one single appearance of sound, one note, one bird call, is vastly peaceful. it um, communicates the deep okayness. And then the next thing, which is a sensation in the body, perhaps, or a footstep, or looking at the sky. Every appearance is both intimate and radiating the okayness and the peace. So again, it is the environment, the equanimity. It's not a personal thing, and it's not something you really have to cultivate because it's there. Another aspect is formlessness, or essencelessness, or emptiness. We start to taste that with a Kensho experience, especially initially, like right after, right as it's unfolding. There's this profound plummet into who knows what, void, nothingness, whatever. But also we don't disappear. It's here. It's also this. It's the sounds and sensations and the movement of mind, and it's also nothing at all. That may be the number one thing we overlook before awakening, is the value and peace and importance and pervasiveness of the essenceless nature, which itself is not even a quality. It can't be called a quality. It's intertwined with everything. And what that looks like to the mind is actually a big relief. It's when we don't have to think about anything. Doesn't mean we have to have no thoughts. It just means we're not grasping onto thoughts, beliefs, etc., to feel okay, to feel safe. What we realize is that they're ghosts. They really are empty of any substance whatsoever. Thoughts, any meaning, substance, purpose. It's really all relative. The thought world. It's any belief, any position held in consciousness is, to use a Buddhist term, dependently co-arisen with its opposite in a sense. And that's how consciousness is experienced. And once you see that, you realize, oh, okay, you're both sides at once. You're the whole of the ocean. So it doesn't really matter what happens with the waves, how many waves there are, how big they are, what they look like, how long they last. It doesn't really matter. That identity itself is empty. Beliefs are empty. So we start to touch into this emptiness at the level of mind, and we can touch very, very deeply into it. And it tends to actually coalesce into the emptiness of the physical form as well, especially right after awakening. Tends to plunge very deeply because of the nature of emptiness. It doesn't pick and choose or differentiate between stages of this or that, or who you think you are. It's just not like that. So when you touch into emptiness, you touch into all of emptiness and the emptiness of all fullness, the emptiness of all form. Now with non-dual realization, clear non-dual realization, which the way I would define that would be to truly realize the formlessness of what appears as substance in all aspects. It's not describable. It's not something I can talk about really. When it happens, it's always a surprise how profound it actually is, and also how simple it is, and how completely natural. Like it's just that way. Couldn't be other. but it does come with a far deeper peace than one had experienced before, even with awakening, with um, the neutrality of consciousness that at times seems just infinite, um, without any struggle or polarity in consciousness. It can feel so peaceful. This piece goes far beyond that. Um, there are some poetic ways of saying it, but the Bible has a phrase, the peace that passeth all understanding. Perhaps that. But to dissolve all attachment with form, essentially. Doesn't mean you live in a world where there's nothing, um, because to be completely free of attachment to form, then you're also free of the attachment to formlessness. They're the same. So it's, again, paradoxical, indescribable, but the peace that comes along with this, I would wish it for anyone on this path, or anyone interested in this undertaking. This is what I would hope they would all taste at some point. And I know it's available to you for sure. So, and there can be a heck of a lot of doubt even up until that point. But you never know what's just beyond the next veil. You never know where the next act of surrendered inquiry is going to lead. So keep that beginner's mind, beginner's heart, and be willing to keep investigating.